This is Animal Attacks, and I'm Christopher. Today, we're looking at moments where a simple photo turns into a situation where distance disappears fast. From a GoPro in a restricted zone beside a feeding brown bear to someone drifting off and ends up kneeling, just meters from a Komodo dragon, before it turns and closes in. Let's begin in Thailand, where a roadside tiger enclosure and a step past a weak fence line turn a photo into a fatal encounter. It was March 14th, 2015, and by early afternoon, the Phet Safari Park in Phetchabun Province, Thailand, had the quiet of a place where admission is 80 baht and the staff count peaks at 3. Kawan Tepsiri was 22 and lived on the outskirts of Bangkok, where his family ran a small noodle stall in a crowded market. He worked weekdays repairing phones in a shared rented storefront and often posted photos of motorcycles, street food, and short trips with friends, usually framing scenes to look more dramatic or cinematic than they really were. Just the usual habit of turning everyday life into something that feels bigger online. That weekend, Kawan went with his friends Nathapong and Syria to a roadside wildlife park that felt more like a cheap stop than a proper zoo. The place was showing its age: rusted fences, cracked concrete, faded signs, and the bigger animals were kept behind old chain link and concrete barriers that looked patched up more than once. By mid-afternoon, they reached the tiger enclosure. Most visitors had moved to shaded stalls, leaving the area quiet in the heat. Inside, an adult Bengal tiger rested near a concrete wall under partial metal shade, largely indifferent to the people outside. Kawan tried to photograph it through the chain link fence, but was frustrated by the mesh interfering with the shot. Walking along the perimeter, he noticed a deteriorated section at the base of the outer fencing, where corrosion and loose anchoring had created a small gap in the lowest barrier layer, weakening the intended secondary separation. The opening was narrow, but large enough for someone to lie flat and slide under. Nathapong warned him not to proceed, and Syria stepped back, insisting the photo wasn't worth the risk. Kawan dismissed their concerns, handed his phone to Nathapong, then lowered himself and slipped through the gap into the restricted buffer zone between the outer fence and the inner enclosure wall. The tiger remained motionless with its head near its front paws as Kawan crouched several yards away, repositioning himself so the animal appeared behind his shoulder in the frame. Witnesses later recalled him making a short whistling sound, likely attempting to draw its attention toward the camera. It almost feels like he was trying to make the moment cooperate with him. The reaction was immediate. The tiger rose abruptly and closed the distance with explosive acceleration, responding to the intrusion into its enclosure buffer zone as a perceived territorial threat. Kawan barely had time to turn before it struck him across the upper body, knocking him into the dirt. A single scream followed, quickly followed by shouting from outside the fence. The tiger then bit into the left side of his neck and shoulder, causing severe soft tissue trauma with likely vascular involvement. Nathapong threw a plastic bottle toward the enclosure without effect, while Syria backed away, trying to call emergency services with shaking hands. Nearby visitors began moving toward the exit after hearing the commotion. Kawan's phone had fallen nearby during the impact, still recording video pointed up toward the sky and fence, with audio picking up screaming, metal shaking, and people shouting for staff. A maintenance worker got there first and hit the alarm near the service gate while calling for help. Additional employees gathered at secured control positions and coordinated containment efforts without entering the enclosure. Witnesses later noted confusion over keys and hesitation about direct intervention, as staff were aware an agitated tiger could redirect its attack. By the time the gate was opened and workers advanced together, making noise, the tiger had already moved deeper into the shaded area of the habitat. Emergency responders arrived about half an hour after the initial call due to the park's distance from the nearest major medical facility. Kawan sustained severe neck and upper shoulder trauma with suspected major vascular injury. He lost consciousness at the scene and went into critical condition during transport. Resuscitation efforts were unsuccessful, and he was pronounced dead either at the scene or shortly after arrival at the hospital. A regional investigation later cited multiple safety failures involving enclosure maintenance and perimeter integrity. The facility received financial penalties and temporary suspension orders before eventually resuming operations under revised inspection requirements. I never thought a simple photo could override every warning I had just been given. Up next, we shift from a roadside enclosure in Thailand to the remote wilderness of Alaska, where distance from rules becomes the real danger. It was August 22nd, 2016, and Corvin Metz had been past the boundary post for 19 minutes when he set a GoPro on a rock at Katmai National Park, 400 meters inside a restricted zone, alone. Corvin was 29, from Missoula, working seasonally as a hiking guide and winter file clerk, and ran a small YouTube channel with a few hundred subscribers focused on unedited trail footage. The Katmai trip was his most ambitious solo journey. He traveled overland for more than 2 weeks, then arrived by float plane after completing mandatory bear safety training. For several days, he stayed near the Brooks Falls viewing platforms, filming bears in the controlled, heavily regulated areas, but later became dissatisfied with the restrictions and began seeking more isolated footage outside designated zones. It's easy to see how the controlled areas start feeling limiting when you're trying to get real footage. By late morning on one of his final days in the area, he left an authorized trail and crossed a posted boundary warning of active bear activity. Beyond it, the terrain shifted into dense creekside vegetation with uneven ground, fallen logs, and narrow water channels through mossy rock, where visibility was low and sound carried unpredictably. At roughly 400 meters beyond the boundary, he reached a section of the creek where a large adult female brown bear was feeding in shallow water. No cubs were visible. The bear remained focused on salmon activity, occasionally shifting position in the current. Corwin set a small action camera on a rock near the water and started recording, then turned on a live stream that only a few people were watching. The feed mostly showed the creek surface and the brush around it. He moved closer along the creek bank, starting at several dozen meters away and gradually reducing the distance, while narrating into his phone in a controlled, steady voice. At that range, the bear continued feeding in the shallow current, focused on salmon movement, and showing only intermittent awareness of his presence. As he advanced further, he lowered himself into a crouch within the brush, using uneven terrain and vegetation for partial cover, pausing at intervals as if gauging the animal's reaction and adjusting his position. The closer he got, the more the whole thing stopped feeling like observation and started feeling like intrusion. At closer range, the bear stopped feeding entirely and turned toward him. The bear focused fully on him, shifted forward, and began moving in his direction. The charge followed within seconds. Corvin attempted to react, but had no time to fully stand or retreat. He was struck and thrown backward into the uneven creek bank, sustaining suspected fractures and significant soft tissue trauma on impact. His phone was dislodged and fell into the water, causing the live stream to cut to distorted, intermittent audio. What followed was a brief, chaotic close-range attack. Corvin attempted to protect his head and torso with his arms as the bear remained in immediate proximity, inflicting additional traumatic injuries during a short sequence of rapid movement along the bank. The bear then disengaged and moved back toward the creek, remaining nearby and intermittently refocusing on the water and surrounding area for several minutes. After things calmed down, Corvin briefly came to a few times, moving a little, but not really able to control it or do anything purposeful. He tried to shift himself on the ground, but couldn't hold it together for long, and his movement faded quickly. Then he slipped back out of consciousness, leaving just the sound of the creek in the background. Emergency responders reached the site after an extended response time due to terrain limitations and distance from the nearest ranger access point. He was found in critical condition and transported to a regional medical facility, but died during treatment or shortly after arrival, despite resuscitative efforts. Medical findings cited multiple fractures and severe soft tissue trauma as contributing factors. A park investigation later confirmed he had entered a restricted backcountry zone beyond clearly marked safety boundaries, and the incident was classified as preventable. Internal documentation from the case was later incorporated into ranger training materials, though the original footage was not released publicly. His social media presence was eventually removed, and public reporting remained limited to brief local coverage of a fatal bear encounter in the Katmai region. I thought staying just a little outside the marked area was still within control. From there, we jumped to a river in Australia, where danger doesn't need to be seen to already be waiting below the surface. It was January 9th, 2017, and by late afternoon on the Daly River in Australia's Northern Territory, Darren Tully had been dropping fish blood through the dock planking into the water for 45 minutes. Darren Tully was 41, from Catherine, where he worked in HVAC and ran small barramundi fishing charters along nearby waterways. He was experienced in regional river conditions and familiar with the presence of crocodiles in the area, treating it as a constant but usually unseen risk rather than an active daily concern. That day, he was with his brother-in-law, Heck Wallace, and Heck's 16-year-old son, Jalen, at a friend's riverside property. They had been fishing earlier and were cleaning barramundi on the dock, letting scraps and fish blood fall through the gaps between the planks into the water below. The river was still and dark beneath them, with only occasional surface movement breaking the reflection of the sky. As the afternoon continued, Darren remained near the edge of the dock, leaning over the railing while handling fish remains. He held a phone briefly over the water, angling it downward as if to capture movement beneath the surface. A dark shape was visible near the dock line, just under the water, while the others remained a short distance away along the structure and shoreline. Most people would have probably just stepped back at that point, even without thinking why. The activity below the dock was not limited to what was visible. A large saltwater crocodile had been present in the submerged area beneath the dock, intermittently drifting and stabilizing in the current, where scent and fish scraps accumulated. It remained submerged and largely motionless, blending into the depth and shadow of the river column. When Darren leaned further over the railing and shifted his weight forward, the crocodile suddenly came up from right below him. It didn't come from the side where they'd been watching. It came straight up from under the dock. Its jaws snapped shut on his right forearm in a single explosive movement, anchoring him instantly and pulling him hard toward the edge of the railing with overwhelming force. His phone slipped from his hand during the impact and fell into the river, vanishing beneath the surface almost immediately. The force of the strike dragged him partway over the railing, his upper body pulled forward as he lost balance. Heck reacted immediately, grabbing his leg and throwing his weight backward against the dock structure to counter the pull and prevent him from being fully dragged into the water. The sudden tension between opposing forces caused Darren to hang partially over the edge for a brief moment. The crocodile started rolling at the surface, twisting its body hard with its tail and upper body. That twisting put extreme force on his arm, especially around the elbow and forearm, and it basically got crushed and ripped apart in seconds, with the arm almost fully severed at the elbow. The crocodile released the detached portion and slipped back beneath the surface, disappearing into the dark water below the dock as the surface briefly churned before settling again. And then, the river just goes back to looking like nothing happened. He pulled Darren fully onto the dock. He was conscious at first, briefly looking at the injury in shock, but with severe hemorrhage from the severed brachial artery. Jalen reacted by pressing clothing against the wound, while he secured a makeshift tourniquet above the elbow using a belt. Darren's condition deteriorated rapidly within moments as bleeding continued and his responsiveness faded. Emergency services were called immediately, with both ground and aeromedical retrieval coordinated due to the remote location and severity of the injury. Despite surgical intervention, he died later that night due to irreversible blood loss and traumatic amputation injuries. Medical findings confirmed complete severance of the brachial artery and catastrophic damage to the forearm and elbow region, with death attributed to irreversible hemorrhagic shock from major vascular injury. Wildlife officers later investigated the site and set traps in the surrounding river system. A large saltwater crocodile was later captured in the surrounding river system and assessed as the likely animal involved based on size and proximity. Authorities reinforced existing warnings regarding feeding practices and blood attraction in high-risk river zones. A brief local report noted the fatal incident, while broader national coverage remained limited. A warning sign was later installed near the dock area, and the property ceased recreational fishing activity on the river edge afterward. I never imagined that something as small as a camera flash could trigger something that fast. Following this, we moved to the forests of Uganda, where proximity alone can turn a routine wildlife viewing into a fatal encounter. It was October 3rd, 2014, in a Forest Edge National Park in Uganda, when a phone flash fired toward a lone bull elephant from roughly 19 feet away, triggering an encounter that ultimately proved fatal. Oswin Prater was 54, a retired geography teacher from Roanoke, Virginia. He'd spent over 20 years in the classroom before retiring and started traveling on his own after a long personal separation. He kept a handwritten bucket list folded in his wallet, and the Uganda trip was one of the first big things he wanted to tick off. He'd recently bought a camera and a smartphone so he could share parts of the trip with his family. The excursion was organized by a licensed safari operator and included 6 tourists, 2 wildlife rangers, and a local tracker named Godfrey, who had worked in the region for years monitoring elephant movement along forest boundary zones. A safety briefing emphasized strict rules, including no flash photography, no sudden movements, no approaching isolated bulls, and maintaining substantial distance whenever elephants were encountered on foot. Oswin initially complied as the group moved along a narrow trail near dense vegetation, eventually stopping when the tracker identified a lone bull elephant, partially concealed among the trees near a clearing. The animal appeared calm, occasionally pulling vegetation with its trunk while the group observed from a controlled distance. Rangers monitored the elephant's posture closely and instructed everyone to remain behind the designated viewing line. As the group adjusted positions for photographs, Oswin shifted to the side for a clearer angle and stepped several feet beyond the spacing boundary while attempting a selfie-style shot with the elephant visible behind him. He turned partially away from the group and raised the phone at shoulder height. The reaction escalated quickly after the sudden movement and getting too close, with the elephant going from alert to charging within seconds. The elephant lifted its head sharply and spread its ears outward before transitioning into a rapid forward charge that closed the distance in seconds. Witnesses later stated that the initial movement appeared almost too fast to process before contact occurred. Oswin attempted to retreat, but slipped against the uneven forest floor near the edge of the clearing, broken by exposed roots and scattered rock. The elephant struck him across the upper body and head with its trunk, throwing him backward onto exposed rock and causing immediate traumatic injury, though he remained conscious and visibly disoriented afterward. The elephant knocked him to the ground and followed through with a brief, forceful trampling motion, producing severe chest and upper body trauma before breaking off and moving a short distance away. During the encounter, a tusk struck his upper arm and shoulder during the charge, causing deep penetrating trauma, soft tissue destruction, and fractures as he was forced to the ground. Rangers later noted that the elephant briefly disengaged before circling back in short, agitated bursts. Behavior consistent with a highly agitated defensive charge, rather than predatory behavior. You can imagine how tense that must have been for the Rangers trying to break that moment safely. He remained conscious, but in critical condition, with rapidly worsening neurological and respiratory distress. His breathing became increasingly shallow, and movement was limited to weak attempts to reposition himself while responders stabilized him at the scene. Emergency radio communication was initiated within minutes, but dense forest access routes, steep slopes, and unstable terrain significantly delayed evacuation. A stretcher team reached the site after a significant delay due to terrain difficulty and coordination challenges. Evacuation to a vehicle access point took considerably longer than standard response times for the area. Even with help on the way, getting someone out of terrain like that is never quick or simple. He was transferred first to a regional medical facility and later to a larger hospital in Kampala. Doctors identified a depressed skull fracture, multiple rib fractures, pulmonary trauma, and internal brain bleeding requiring emergency surgery. Despite intensive treatment over the following days, his condition continued to deteriorate due to cerebral swelling and complications from severe blunt force injuries. He died several days later in hospital. A post-incident review later concluded that ranger response procedures were generally followed appropriately, though the group's spacing discipline had broken down during the photography stop. The safari operator was temporarily suspended pending review. Oswin's belongings were later returned to his family, including the handwritten bucket list he had carried throughout the trip. The incident received limited international reporting and was largely described in regional coverage as a fatal wildlife tourism accident involving a bull elephant near Uganda's protected forest boundary zones. I thought maintaining distance was enough as long as I stayed aware of my surroundings. Next, we head to an isolated volcanic landscape in Indonesia, where stepping off the path removes all remaining protection. It was May 18th, 2016, on Rinca Island in Komodo National Park, Indonesia, during the dry season, when a guided group moved along a marked trail through hot, exposed terrain of scrub, basalt, and dry creek beds under strict wildlife rules. Remy Fauchard was 27, from Lyon, France, working a teaching contract in Java while traveling during breaks and documenting his trips with a small camera and smartphone. He ran a modest travel blog, followed mainly by friends and family. During group activities, he often lagged behind, stopping to photograph wildlife or landscapes even when the rest of the group continued moving forward. The group got to Rinca that morning by boat from Labuan Bajo with a local guide who knew Komodo dragons well. Before they started walking, everyone got the usual safety talk. Stay on the marked trails, keep your distance from the big reptiles, and don't wander off from the group, especially out in the open scrub where it's easy to lose sight of people. Those briefings always sound simple until you're actually out in that kind of open, uneven ground. The trek initially proceeded without incident. The group moved at a steady pace across the dry, uneven ground, pausing occasionally at shaded rest points. Remy, however, repeatedly stopped to take photographs, allowing himself to fall behind the main group. As the terrain became more open and less structured, the distance between him and the others increased. Near the final portion of the return route, the guide paused briefly at a designated rest point to confirm the group count. It was during this moment that Remy was no longer immediately visible. He had already left the main trail after noticing movement in the scrub near a dry creek bed off to the side of the route. That area was uneven and broken, with patches of low vegetation, exposed rock, and shallow dips in the ground that limited visibility at ground level. In this environment, Remy encountered a large adult Komodo dragon moving slowly through the scrub. He first observed it from a distance and began photographing it with his camera. After several shots, he switched to his smartphone and moved closer in stages to improve his framing, eventually kneeling on uneven volcanic rock at roughly 26 feet away while filming. The dragon remained still for several seconds, tongue flicking as it sampled the air. It then turned straight toward him and suddenly lunged forward in a short burst. Remy tried to stand and back away, but slipped on the sloped rock and fell backward, still holding his phone. The first bite struck his right calf, with the Komodo dragon pulling backward and twisting violently, tearing muscle and deeper tissue. He struck the animal in response, briefly forcing it to release. He tried to crawl away, but after only a short distance, the dragon closed in again and bit the back of his right thigh, causing severe tissue destruction with suspected major vascular injury and rapid hemorrhage from the thigh. His movement slowed as he called for help, but the terrain offered no cover, and the group was out of sight. Out there, once you're down, there's really nowhere to disappear to. The guide noticed the missing participant during a head count and moved back along the trail, locating him shortly after. He drove the animal off using loud deterrence and close presence, then applied direct pressure to the thigh wound with clothing while radioing for emergency assistance. A stretcher team was dispatched from the park station and reached the location after a delay caused by terrain difficulty and distance from the main trail system. Remy was stabilized on site as much as possible before being transported by boat to the mainland for further medical care. Despite evacuation efforts, his condition deteriorated due to severe blood loss from the thigh wound. Medical assessment identified major vascular damage and extensive soft tissue injury. The primary cause of death was recorded as hypovolemic shock resulting from uncontrolled hemorrhage. Following the incident, park authorities reviewed trekking compliance and reinforced existing rules regarding distance and off-trail movement. The guide's response was later assessed as appropriate and timely under the circumstances. Remy's belongings were returned to his family through official channels, including his camera and personal journal. I never considered that a moment of hesitation on a wet surface could decide everything. From there, we jumped to a working marina in Washington, where everyday spaces near water still carry risks people rarely think about. It was July 4th, 2014, at a working marina in Westport, Washington, during early evening when the docks were busy with boats, pedestrians, and seasonal marine activity along open water. Nola Harridge was 34, working as an administrative coordinator at a dental practice in Olympia. She had little experience around open water and was more comfortable in controlled indoor environments than slippery marine docks. That evening, she was visiting the marina with Neil Webb, 37, a high school biology teacher she had been dating for several months, along with his 8-year-old daughter. They stopped near the dock after noticing a group of California sea lions resting on floating platforms nearby. Several people had gathered along the edge taking photos. At K-Dock, the sea lions shifted, barked, and occasionally slipped into the water before climbing back onto the pontoon. The aluminum gangways leading toward the platforms were damp with sea spray and algae buildup, especially near the edges. People tend to underestimate how slick those walkways get once everything's wet. Nola stepped onto one of the narrow gangways to get a clearer photo, holding her phone at chest height as she moved farther out than the rest of the group. Neil called for her to step back, but she stayed focused on framing the shot as movement increased ahead. A sudden burst of splashing among the sea lions caused her to shift her footing on the wet metal surface. Her foot slid on the algae-coated edge, and she lost balance, falling forward into the water below with no time to react. The fall dropped her directly beside the floating platform, where several sea lions had already become agitated by the sudden splash. Witnesses later described the animals circling and surging through the water around her as she resurfaced near the pontoon. The cold water triggered an immediate shock response. She surfaced gasping and disoriented, struggling to orient herself toward the dock ladder. As she tried to push herself toward the supports, one of the sea lions lunged through the water and bit into her left forearm during the confusion. She screamed and pulled the arm against herself while trying to stay afloat. During the struggle, she slipped beneath the surface several times and appeared to inhale water before resurfacing again in panic. The combination of cold shock, heavy clothing, repeated submersion, and the arm injury made it harder for her to keep herself stable in the water. Once she resurfaced, she kept trying to face the dock, but the water kept throwing her off balance again. People nearby threw flotation devices toward her, but the movement in the water made them difficult to grab. Several witnesses later reported seeing more movement from the sea lions beneath the surface near her position, causing hesitation before anyone entered the water. Within moments, Neil climbed down from a nearby ladder and reached her, keeping her head above water, while others helped from the dock. She was eventually pulled out with assistance from multiple bystanders. Emergency services arrived shortly afterward. Initial assessment noted hypothermia, respiratory distress from water aspiration, and a deep forearm injury consistent with a sea lion bite. During transport, her condition worsened as breathing complications increased despite warming measures and oxygen support. She was taken to a nearby hospital, but later suffered cardiac arrest linked to cold water immersion, aspiration, and respiratory failure. Resuscitation efforts were unsuccessful. A later safety review recommended additional warning signs, improved barriers near the gangways, and stricter controls around areas where marine wildlife gathered close to pedestrian docks.